Right now, on your car, there is a slow motion attack happening in places you almost never look. Not on the paint, not under the hood, not in the engine, on the brakes. And the most dangerous part is that it does not begin with a warning light. It does not begin with a grinding noise. It does not begin with a mechanic shaking his head and telling you that your whole brake system is finished. It begins quietly. A film, a residue, a crust, a paste of brake dust, road spray, moisture, and in colder places, salt. That mixture gets into the exact places your brake system needs to move freely. Around the caliper, around the hardware, around the pad ears, around the brackets, around the rotor hat, around the backing plates, around the slide areas that were supposed to stay clean enough to move, release, and breathe. And once that buildup starts hardening, your brakes stop aging normally. They start dying early. Pads drag when they should release. Calipers stick when they should glide. Rotors run hotter than they should. Fuel economy drops. Heat builds. Wear accelerates. Then one day you hear the sentence drivers hear every single day. You need pads, rotors, maybe calipers too. And most people accept that like the weather. They think brakes are just supposed to die young. They think rust is normal. They think seized hardware is bad luck. They think the system simply wore out. But in a shocking number of cases, what actually killed those brakes was not mileage. It was contamination. And the secret Japanese liquid that helps stop that process before it starts costs almost nothing. It is not exotic. It is not blue. It is not imported in a tiny glass bottle with a name nobody can pronounce. It is water, plain water, used intentionally, used correctly, used before corrosion locks your brake system into a life of expensive, unnecessary suffering. That is the secret. And yes, that sounds too simple. Good. The simplest truths are usually the ones people ignore the longest. By the end of this script, you will understand why this cheap rinse matters, why Japanese maintenance culture has always respected this kind of prevention more than Western repair culture, how brake systems really die, why dealers make more money replacing parts than preserving them, and how one low-cost liquid habit can dramatically extend the life of your pads, rotors, calipers, brackets, lines, and everything attached to them. Now let me make one thing very clear before we go any further. This title is written in the dramatic style these channels use. No. One set of pads is not literally going to go 500,000 miles. That is not the point. The point is that a brake system can live vastly longer when you stop letting it corrode itself to death. Because there is a huge difference between brakes wearing out from honest use and brakes being murdered by neglect. Here is the part almost nobody explains properly. Your brake system does not only wear, it also corrodes. Those are not the same thing. Wear is expected. Friction material gets used up, pads get thinner, rotors eventually reach minimum thickness. That is normal. Corrosion is different. Corrosion makes good parts behave like bad parts. Corrosion turns sliding parts into seized parts. Corrosion keeps pads from releasing fully. Corrosion turns a simple pad replacement into a caliper replacement. Corrosion turns a routine service into a four-figure invoice. And once you understand that, the entire brake business starts looking very different. Because if you can slow corrosion, you can slow a lot of the fake wear people are paying for. Think about what happens every time you drive. Your brake pads shed dust. Your wheels collect grime. Water splashes up from the road. Mud, grit, slush, sand, road film, winter chemicals, coastal salt air, and microscopic metal particles settle into the exact places where your brake hardware needs clearance. Then the car sits, the water evaporates, the contaminants stay. Then it happens again and again and again. 1,000 heat cycles, 1,000 wet-dry cycles, 1,000 tiny layers of filth turning into one giant problem. Drivers see the outside of the wheel and think the car is clean. The brakes do not care what the wheel face looks like. The brakes care what is trapped behind it. That is where the damage starts. This is why some drivers get incredible brake life and others burn through hardware like they are cursed. It is not always driving style. It is not always traffic. It is not always vehicle design. Sometimes it is simply this. One driver lets corrosive grime bake onto the system for months. The other washes it away before it hardens. That difference matters a lot. And this is where Japanese maintenance philosophy quietly humiliates everyone else. Because one of the most underrated principles in Japanese vehicle care is not glamorous. It is not a miracle additive. It is not a horsepower trick. It is respect for cleanliness in mechanical systems. Keep surfaces clean. Keep moving parts free. Keep fluid fresh. Prevent corrosion before it becomes a repair. That is how machines last. not by magic, by discipline. The reason this matters so much for brakes is that brake systems live in a brutal environment. They sit low, they get blasted by road contamination, they generate heat, they cool down fast, they get soaked, they dry out. They are constantly exposed to dust, water, and corrosion triggers. And in winter states or coastal areas, they are basically living in a chemical war zone. So what does the average driver do? Nothing. They wait until the noise starts. That is exactly backwards. By the time the noise starts, the system has often been cooking for months. And this is where the cheap liquid changes everything. The secret is not wash your car. That is not enough. The secret is to deliberately flush the brake zone, the underbody, the wheel wells, behind the wheels, the lower suspension area, the places where salt and dust hide, the places where the brake hardware actually lives. Official owner guidance already points in this direction. Mazda, for example, explicitly warns that road chemicals and salt can collect on the underbody, accelerate rust and deterioration, and recommends thoroughly flushing the underbody and wheel housings with water at the end of winter and even monthly. It also warns that merely wetting grime without removing it can do more harm than good. Read that again. The damage is not theory. The corrosion is not imaginary. The rinse is not a folk myth. The manual itself is telling you the same thing, just in dry corporate language nobody gets emotional about. And that is why people ignore it, because the manual does not scream, I will. If you live where roads get salted, and you are not rinsing the brake area regularly, you are gambling brake hardware against chemistry, and chemistry does not lose often. Now here's the part that should make you genuinely angry. A lot of expensive brake jobs are not really brake jobs. They are corrosion jobs. They are contamination jobs. They are neglect jobs. They are the invoice version of a problem that should have been interrupted months earlier by a hose, a wash bay, or a $2 rinse. Dealers are not going to put a giant sign up that says, come in less often by washing the corrosive garbage off your brakes. Why would they? Pads and rotors are profitable. Calipers are profitable. Brake service packages are profitable. Stuck slide diagnosis is profitable. Your rotors are heat spotted because the pad was dragging is profitable. But a driver who rinses the system before it seizes, that driver is boring. Boring customers are terrible for repair revenue. Now let me be fair. This is not some evil conspiracy where mechanics gather in a candlelit basement and swear loyalty to rust. A lot of technicians know this, a lot of good shops know this, but the business model still rewards repair more than prevention. And prevention is usually your job, not theirs. So here's the actual Japanese-style logic in plain English. If contamination causes corrosion, and corrosion causes sticking, and sticking causes heat, and heat causes wear, then the cheapest brake repair on earth is stopping contamination before it turns into sticking. That is why the water matters. Not because water is magical, because it removes what is destructive. Salt, dust, grit, chemical residue, mud packed around hardware, the filth that holds moisture against metal, the paste that quietly turns freedom of movement into resistance. And brake systems hate resistance. Now let us go deeper, because there is another half to this secret most people miss. Your brakes can corrode from the outside and the inside. Outside corrosion comes from road contamination. Inside corrosion comes from old brake fluid. Brake fluid is not immortal. It absorbs moisture over time, and as it degrades, it can contribute to corrosion and braking issues. AAA explains this directly. Brake fluid naturally absorbs moisture, and degraded fluid can lead to spongy pedal feel, corrosion, and reduced braking performance. Honda's own maintenance guidance says brake fluid should be checked monthly and replaced according to the maintenance schedule, and even warns that improper fluid use can cause corrosion and decrease system life. So the real liquid secret is actually a two-front war: fresh water outside, fresh brake fluid inside. That is how you protect the system. Clean the corrosion triggers off the exterior. Replace moisture-contaminated hydraulic fluid on schedule in the interior. Most drivers do neither. Then they act shocked when the brake system ages like milk. Now let us talk about the 500,000-mile idea. Again, not one set of pads, not one untouched rotor, not one magical immortal caliper. What lasts 500,000 miles is the platform when maintained correctly, the brackets that do not rot solid, the pistons that do not seize early, the lines that do not rot out prematurely, the hardware that keeps moving, the wheel end components that do not cook themselves because something started dragging at 80,000 miles and nobody caught it. This is the difference between replacing what is consumable and replacing what never should have died that soon in the first place. That is a massive difference. So here's exactly what you do. First, wait until the brakes are cool. Do not come off the highway, pull into a wash bay, and blast a glowing hot rotor with cold water like you are punishing it for your commute. Let the system cool. Second, use a gentle but thorough water rinse on the wheel wells behind the wheels, the lower suspension area, and the underbody zones near the brakes. You are not trying to carve metal with a pressure washer. You are trying to remove the corrosive material clinging to everything. Third, if you live in a salt-heavy region, do this repeatedly during winter, not once in spring after the damage has already had months to mature. End of storm, end of slush week, end of nasty road chemical cycles. Monthly at minimum in bad conditions is a far more intelligent rhythm than annual panic. Fourth, do not just make the grime wet and walk away. That is one of the dumbest mistakes people make. The goal is removal, not hydration. Flush until the residue is gone. Fifth, after any wash that leaves the brakes wet, dry them the smart way. Drive slowly and lightly apply the brakes until normal braking feel returns. Mazda explicitly warns that wet brakes increase stopping distance and can cause pulling, and recommends lightly applying them to restore performance. Mazda Owner's Manual 6th, pair that outside rinse habit with scheduled brake fluid service, not whenever you feel like it, not only when the fluid looks ugly, on schedule. That combination is the real long life formula. If you only rinse the outside but ignore dying fluid inside the hydraulic system, you are only fighting half the battle. If you only change fluid but let salt and brake dust cake onto the calipers and hardware, you are also fighting half the battle. Do both. Outside clean, inside protected. That is how adults maintain machines. Now let us destroy one more myth. Some people hear water and instantly panic. Water on brakes? That is dangerous. No. Driving through rain already puts water on brakes. Puddles put water on brakes. Car washes put water on brakes. What is dangerous is letting corrosive contamination stay on them forever. The risk is not the rinse. The risk is the months of chemical filth you leave behind when you skip the rinse. And there is one more reason this works so well. It changes what your mechanic sees later. A clean, maintained brake assembly is easier to inspect, easier to service, easier to pad slap correctly when appropriate, easier to disassemble without breakage, and less likely to turn a simple maintenance job into a seized nightmare. Clean systems are cheaper systems. That is true in engines, it is true in cooling systems, it is true in transmissions, and it is absolutely true in brakes. So why do almost no drivers do this consistently? Because prevention is emotionally unsatisfying. Replacing rotors feels dramatic. Replacing calipers feels important. Paying a 4-digit invoice feels like real car ownership. A $2 wash does not. It feels too small to matter. That is exactly why it matters. The most expensive failures are often the ones prevented by routines, so cheap people laugh at them. Until the invoice arrives, then the joke disappears. So if you want the shortest possible version of this entire script, here it is. The Japanese secret is not a miracle bottle. It is a maintenance mindset. Do not let corrosive contamination stay on precision parts. Use cheap water to remove destructive grime from the outside. Use fresh brake fluid to protect the inside. Do that consistently, and your brake system stops aging like a disposable item and starts behaving like a long-life mechanical system. That is how you make brakes last 500,000 miles, not by fantasy, by refusing to let them rot themselves to death. And if you're still ignoring this because it sounds too simple, ask yourself one question. Would you rather spend $2 interrupting corrosion or $800 rebuilding what corrosion destroyed? Exactly. So stop worshiping expensive repairs. Stop waiting for squeals and pulsation and stuck calipers to tell you what months of grime were already saying silently. Rinse the system, service the fluid, protect the hardware, and stop letting dirt and salt decide how long your brakes live. Because the cheapest brake secret in the world is still the one most people refuse to use, water. That's it. That's the whole banned secret. And the reason it feels hidden is because nobody makes enough money when you learn it in time.